afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm Susan Collins, the Joan and Sanford Weill Dean here at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy, and I'm delighted to have all of you here for this afternoon's event. We have our final policy talks at the Ford School this year, and I know a number of you have been with us throughout the season, and I hope that you will join us again as we launch a new series next year. I'd like to extend a special thanks to Kyo Sutusi, who has supported this event with the Human Rights Initiative. They are one of our co-sponsors. And I also am delighted to welcome Carrie Booth-Walling here, who was a postdoc at the Ford School a couple of years ago and is currently assistant professor at Albion College and is here with a number of her students. And so a special welcome to all of you. We're delighted to have you join us. Today's policy talks will focus on the hybrid tribunal that was established by the United Nations and the Cambodian government to try officials for crimes during the Pol Pot era. Our speakers, who I'll introduce in just a moment, will be discussing how effective those tribunals have been in bringing healing and closure to survivors of the genocidal Khmer Rouge regime. And they'll also talk a bit about the tribunal's impact in shaping both the present and the future of this very courageous post-conflict society. And so I know that we are in for a very interesting discussion about a set of important topics. Our talk today will be moderated by Ford School professor Susan Waltz, who is very well known to many here in this audience as a distinguished human rights scholar with a deep and enduring commitment to engagement and advocacy related to human rights. Among her many impressive achievements, she was the first American to chair the International Board of Amnesty International. And while serving in that capacity, she helped launch the international movement for an arms trade treaty to staunch the flow of weapons to countries where they're likely to fuel human rights abuses. And she worked with a number of others to map the strategy for moving from a code of conduct on arms trade to a full-fledged international treaty. That treaty finally passed just recently, last year, in the United Nations General Assembly, and that will help to make our world certainly somewhat safer, and I think we all are indebted to Susan for her efforts with many others to finally move that to fruition. Susan currently chairs the board of the Quaker United Nations Office, which works with the UN, multilateral organizations, government delegations, and NGOs to improve international standards and practices of peace and justice. Margo Picken, who is our Towsley Foundation policymaker in residence, is teaching at the Ford School this semester while on leave from the London School of Economics. At LSE, she served as founding director of the Center for Study of Human Rights, and she's had a long and quite remarkable career in human rights. In 1986, she established and directed the first office of Amnesty International at the United Nations in New York. And from 1988 to 1995, she managed the Human Rights Program for the Ford Foundation. She then began her work with the London School of Economics, continuing to advise several human rights projects for the UN and for the Ford Foundation. And again, we've been delighted to have her here with us over the past number of weeks. In her decades of service, she's left really a trail of goodwill, I might say, throughout the world in a range of countries like Angola, East Timor, the former Soviet Union, Sweden, and most recently Cambodia, where she directed the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I do want to mention that her visit here would not have been possible without very generous support from the Towsley Foundation, which established our Policymaker in Residence program more than a decade ago. And Margo, I can't look at you, I'm looking at your back, but we're really, we've been delighted to host you here over part of this semester. Joining Margo in this conversation is Assistant Professor John Ciorciari, who served as senior legal advisor to the Documentation Center of Cambodia, which established an archive of photographs and papers documenting the atrocities of the Khmer Rouge regime. He is, of course, a very well-known and beloved professor here at the Ford School and is well-known to particularly many of our students who are here. His first book, The Limits of Alignment, examines security alliances in developing states in Southeast Asia, and hot off the press, his recently published second book, which we will be releasing in an event here in the fall, is entitled Hybrid Justice, The Extraordinary Chambers in the courts of Cambodia, and that directly addresses today's topic, the legacy of the Khmer Rouge tribunals. So I'm very pleased to have this extremely knowledgeable and compassionate set of individuals with us here today to launch an important conversation about post-conflict reconciliation and recovery. I'd like to remind those of you in the audience that if you have a question for one of our speakers, please write it on one of the cards that you should have received when you came in. We will have Ford School volunteers circulating to collect those cards a little bit later in the program. And with the help of Assistant Professor Joy Rohde and two of our Master's Public Policy students, Ceci Burns and Brock Redpath, we'll be selecting and then reading the questions during the Q&A session. If you're joining us online, please tweet in a question and use the hashtag #PolicyTalks. Well, before our speakers begin, we'd like to introduce today's topic with a short clip from the film Dogara by Patrice Leconte. And so with no further ado, we will start that film, and then I will turn things over to our panel.
Thanks everyone for coming. I'm really delighted to be here myself, and am very much looking forward to this conversation this afternoon. When the name Cambodia is mentioned, for me, I think like many others of my generation, it immediately carries us back to the era of the Vietnam War, and then shortly after that war ended, the genocide that took place in Cambodia. I remember at the end of the Vietnam War in 1975 that Americans were very, very happy to think no more about Southeast Asia, and if anyone, if it never came up in the news again, we would be only too happy. Only to learn 3 or 4 years later that while our eyes had been turned from this region, terrible events had unfolded in Cambodia, what was then called the Democratic Republic of Kampuchea, where up to 3 million people lost their lives, some of them killed outright for the crime of wearing glasses, which indicated that they were literate. But it wasn't for some time that the atrocities of that period were revealed. And if you haven't seen the film The Killing Fields, it spells out many of the events that happened in this time. In 2003, many years then after the atrocities of the Cambodian genocide, The Cambodian government and the United Nations agreed on a formula for an international hybrid kind of a tribunal to look back at those crimes that had taken place in the 1970s. But, of course, between 1975 and 2003, 2005, 35 years had rolled by. The crimes had taken place in one era, but we were now looking at addressing them in quite another. And that's the tension that we're really setting out to look at today. How do you think about the crimes that have taken place in one era up against the performance in a different era some years later? And unfortunately, one of the things that has to early on be put on the table is that the current government of Cambodia has itself racked up a pretty atrocious record of human rights. So how are the trials that are intended to redress the problems of the past, how do they really relate to the contemporary situation in Cambodia? So that's the focus of our conversation this afternoon, and I'm delighted that we have two policy experts, people who have deep connections to the region and deep experience to share with us. Margo, as you have heard, headed up the Cambodia's, the UN's office in Cambodia for the High Commissioner of Human Rights. And one of the main responsibilities of her office during the time that she was there from 2001 to 2007 was to help the Cambodian government build up judicial expertise and begin to modernize its judicial system. She was also, her office at the same time, was also responsible for monitoring the human rights situation in Cambodia and for looking at what could be done to help local human rights groups operate safely and to investigate where necessary some pretty delicate situations. So Margo's perspective in this conversation is focused on the present. That is her point of reference. John, by contrast, has worked since 1999 on thinking about accountability for the past. He's been a legal advisor with the Cambodian Documentation Center, which has provided much of the evidence, maybe most of the evidence that's been used in the tribunals. So we have this two people who are very knowledgeable, a lot of experience to shed light on the issue of the interplay between past and present from two rather different perspectives. So let me begin by asking you, Margo, if you, and then you, John, the same sort of question. If you could lay out a few facts or a few items that the audience probably would want to bear in mind as we, just to sort of set the stage, if you would lay out a few things that the audience might want to hold in mind as we open the conversation.
Good evening. I'd like you to imagine Cambodia today, and the clips that came from the film Dogora shows, I think, very, very well an aspect of Cambodia. The film actually was banned in Cambodia. It's not it's not been allowed to be seen, which is very sad. I want you to imagine a country of just under 15 million people, a very resilient people, a people that are longing for decent lives. And as you've seen from the clip, over half the population are under 24. So it's a very young population. You saw those babies and children on the motorbikes. In preparing for today, I browsed the web just to catch up on the latest news. And I saw that really very little seems to have changed since I left Cambodia in 2007. Cambodia remains one of the poorest countries in the world. Nearly 70% of its population subsist on under $2 a day, and it remains one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And its Prime Minister, Hun Sen, remains Prime Minister and has been Prime Minister with one or two short intermissions for almost 30 years. I want you to keep these facts in mind. One of the issues that we dealt with a lot when I was in Cambodia, and I saw remains perhaps the most burning issue of today, is the issue of Cambodia's land and natural resources. 80% of Cambodia's population lives in rural areas, and the majority of them subsist on tiny plots of land and on foraging. Now, certainly when I was there, and it seems to have escalated since, according to a recent report by Global Witness, some 76% of Cambodia's arable land has been leased to agricultural companies. Now, this is a problem that is now, as many of you will know, it's occurring in many countries of the world, but I think Cambodia was amongst the first to be exposed to massive land grabbing. Land grabbing is perhaps not the right, it's what everybody in Cambodia, the language that they use. Now, since 2003, it's estimated that at least 400,000 people have been forced off the land. And 400,000 people is a lot of people, and they have nowhere to go. Their leaders and the leaders of communities that protest against evictions from the land are often imprisoned and charged on charges of incitement or infringement of private property. Cambodia is very rich, or has been very rich in natural resources. But these are rapidly being stripped to the benefit of a very small and corrupt elite. In fact, a friend told me recently, I haven't been in Cambodia for 5 years, and so things have changed. But one thing he told me was that now the favorite mode of transport for the elite is Porsches and Mercedes. Now, when I was there, it was Lexuses, but obviously now
Styles have changed.
the style has changed. I found that a little bit upsetting, actually. The other issue that I want you to bear in mind is that a major plank of Cambodia's economy, as many of you will know, because you'll probably be wearing clothes made in Cambodia, is the garment industry. And a recent survey of major clothing brands found that none are doing anything to help provide basic living wages for the garment workers. That includes brands such like Gap and others. Now, most of the garment workers are young women from Cambodia's rural areas, and they earn, on an average, about $100 a month, most of which they try to send home to their struggling families in the countryside. Now, in January, they demonstrated. There were large-scale demonstrations at the beginning of January in Phnom Penh. And the police opened fire, and 4 of the demonstrators were killed, and 21 of those arrested have been in prison since then. They'll come to court next week on various charges of incitement to violence and other charges. Now, by way of contrast, in January 2004, the most popular Labour leader in Cambodia, whose name was Ciorciari, was shot dead in the middle of the capital, Phnom Penh, in broad daylight. Now, nobody has been found guilty of his murder, and it remains unresolved. And that is true also of a number of contract-style killings that occurred in Phnom Penh, also in broad daylight, during that period. These unresolved murders join hundreds of other unresolved murders and attacks on the opposition voices to Cambodia's status quo since the peace agreements of 1991. So many hope that the Khmer Rouge trials dealing with the past will unlock the pattern of impunity in Cambodia today. I must say my worry is that instead they may have entrenched impunity in today's Cambodia and serve to entrench the current leadership in power.
All right. Do you want to add then a few background?
Absolutely. There are three things that I'll start with that I think are worth keeping in mind as you listen to our conversation. First, essentially no one in Cambodia is untouched, directly or indirectly, by the tragedy of democratic Kampuchea. In a period of about 3 years and 9 months, an estimated 1.5 to 2.5 million, nobody really knows, people perished out of a population, a pre-war population of just over 7 million, in an area roughly the size of the state of Michigan. We're talking about a period of intense human suffering as the Khmer Rouge, an ultra-leftist organization born out of the cauldron of the Vietnam War, took power and sought to return Cambodia to what it called Year Zero, which was a new blank slate, free from foreign influence and from the influence of the hereditary elites in Cambodia, and return the country to some sort of an ultra-Maoist agrarian model that would be pure of those influences. Most of the people who died out of those 2 or 3 million died of starvation, but many others died of overwork, of disease, and of summary and arbitrary killing without trial. Studies done by psychiatrists in the last several years, based here in the United States, estimate that among those who have been interviewed, who are above the age of school-age children in the year when the Khmer Rouge regime ended, something upwards of 90% of people illustrate symptoms of major post-traumatic stress disorder. So, number one, the Khmer Rouge period is one that even for those many who were born after the Khmer Rouge rule ended, is something that has a long trail in Cambodia. Certainly not the source of all the country's problems, but absolutely something that has deeply affected the lives of many Cambodians and continues to do so today. The second thing that I'd like you to keep in mind is that the Khmer Rouge period, while certainly the bloodiest and most horrific chapter in the country's tormented modern history, is not the only one. It was immediately preceded by a period of 5 years of civil war, during which a US-backed military regime carried out counterinsurgency campaigns against Khmer Rouge and contributed human rights violations of their own. Of course, the Khmer Rouge, on their side of the conflict, also committed abuses, and the US dropped, during the period of that 5-year civil war, more tonnage of bombs on Cambodia, again, a country the size of the state of Michigan, than the US dropped on both Germany and Japan combined in all of the Second World War. Right after the Khmer Rouge exited power, they were pushed off of center stage by a group of rebels, defected Khmer Rouge cadres who came with the Vietnamese army at their backs, and that ushered in a period of some 12 years of Vietnamese military occupation in the country, a period of continued armed strife and a period of continued human rights abuses. Then after an 18-month interlude of UN intervention, you moved into an unstable power-sharing arrangement which soon gave way to what I think we could call a sort of a competitive authoritarian model of government under the incumbent prime minister whom Margo referenced, Hun Sen. And so Cambodia is a country that is still dealing with one particularly gory chapter of its history, but that chapter is embedded in a number of others, and there are a lot of dirty hands in Cambodia's history, which is going to be very important when we talk about the politics of the tribunal. The third thing that I would like you to keep in mind is that the current incumbent government of Cambodia, the one that Margo, I think, very accurately described as having many human rights faults of its own, ranging from environmental and labor-related issues to suppression of opposition parties, is one whose history is intimately, I'd say even inextricably linked to the Khmer Rouge movement. Hun Sen himself and other senior leaders of the incumbent government started their careers as low-level Khmer Rouge cadres. They are among those who defected from the eastern zone in the so-called Parrot's Beak down here in the corner near Ho Chi Minh City, and then returned with the Vietnamese army to install a new government, replacing the Khmer Rouge regime with something called the People's Republic of Kampuchea. Hun Sen and his associates at the higher echelons of the Cambodian government have built much of their career on the narrative that they were the ones who ousted the Khmer Rouge from power, and that after the UN peacekeepers came but failed to defang the Khmer Rouge insurgency, they, the incumbent party, the Hun Sen government, were the ones who made the combination of blood sacrifices in counterinsurgency and also the difficult sort of deal-making in terms of reconciliations and amnesties necessary to bring the Khmer Rouge insurgency to heel. And so there are a couple of reasons embedded in what I just said of why this Khmer Rouge trial process is not just important to the average Cambodian who knows that their uncle was killed or that their grandparents continue to suffer from emotional ailments stemming from the trauma. It's also something that is intensely important at the very roots of the incumbent government, both because that government grew out of the Khmer Rouge movement and also because so much of its legitimacy is based on the narrative that we're the ones who got rid of the Khmer Rouge scourge from society.
Thank you. So putting together this review of the past, the snapshot of the present, was it 1997 that Hun Sen approached the United Nations and said, will you help us put together a tribunal that can allow us to deal with these crimes of the past? And they spent the, next 6 years or so negotiating the fine points of what this tribunal would look like, and it finally got off the ground about, 2005 or 6?
2006.
2006. So it's not, it's called the Extraordinary Chambers of the Courts of Cambodia. It's not a uniquely Cambodian instance. It's got international component to it. And they've undertaken to try a number of people for crimes that were committed quite some time ago. So my question now that comes to you, and we'll start with you, John, thinking about the past, is this court has now been in operation for 8 years or so. What has been achieved? And we've agreed beforehand that John would help us think about what the successes, what the relative successes are, and Margo would help us think about what the biggest failures have been to date. And I frame it this way because within the community of human rights advocates, among people who care about justice, among people who care about Cambodia, there are a lot of concerns and misgivings about the functioning of these trials and what they've achieved. So it's a really unique opportunity that we have people sitting, coming together that can help us see both sides of the story. So if you'll share with us, some insights into relative successes.
Sure, and I appreciate the caveat because yes, this is a highly problematic enterprise, but I'm happy to share a few thoughts on what are its relative strong points. The first, and probably the most important to a lot of Cambodian observers, is that this tribunal, which as Susan described is a hybrid court that mixes domestic and international laws, procedures, and personnel, is the first credible judicial organ to convict anybody of crimes committed during the Khmer Rouge era. Some 2 million odd people dead, 35 years went by, and not a single person was convicted by anything resembling a credible judicial process of any of those crimes. In 1979, the Vietnamese, after occupying the country, held a kind of 4-day show trial where Pol Pot and Foreign Minister Ieng Sary were tried in absentia, but their conviction came after the court had announced on its first day that they were guilty of genocide, and after defense lawyers said, "We plead guilty, except we would like the mitigating factor to be known that they were only the puppets of the hegemonistic Chinese." So that was not a credible proceeding by any standards. This is the first one that's occurred that one could say followed some due process norms and delivered a verdict, the first of which was against Duc, the former head of an infamous internal security prison in Phnom Penh. You can visit on the site of that facility the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum if you go to Cambodia, where something like 16,000 people were tortured before being clubbed to death and thrown in ditches to save precious bullets. The second verdict, by the way, against 2 more senior leaders is due out in a month or so, and those are people who are sort of cabinet rank, number 2 and number 4 in the hierarchy beside Pol Pot. The second thing I think that one could say is a relative success of this process is that it's almost as rare to find in Cambodia an example of a credible judicial process at all. And when I say a credible process, both Margo and I are going to agree that there's been political interference, there have been credible corruption allegations at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. It's far from perfect. But if we set the bar relatively low and say, do you have a process where you have an organized introduction of evidence, questioning of witnesses, a zealous prosecution and a zealous defense, some of the very basic elements of a fair trial. It's a rarity in Cambodia. Most trials are done by the 2 sides coming in with various in-kind benefits, which are then provided to the judge, who issues a settlement, and usually the richer or the stronger side predictably wins. If the government is on one side of the case, it's almost a foregone conclusion what the result will be. This is an example for the society to see how international justice is done. Not perfectly. I'm not going to argue that. Nothing close to perfection, but having many of the ingredients of a due process. A third thing that I think one could say is a positive, and one of the rationales for having a hybrid court that's located close to the locus delicti, or scene of the crime, is that you have the access of the survivor population. Something like 220,000 Cambodians have been able physically to visit the courtroom proceedings, to sit in an auditorium similar in size to the one that you're sitting in now, and then behind a glass screen watch some of the proceedings, and also have explanations given to them offline by court officials of how the process works, of what's being investigated and how, of who the suspects are, and so forth. And a fourth thing that I think you could say, and I'll end with this fourth one, that you could say is a positive outcome of this tribunal, is that in addition to the public outreach, to some extent, and I want to emphasize it's very limited, but against Cambodia's low starting point is nevertheless significant. There's been an opportunity, because of this close working relationship between Cambodian and international officials, to have some transfer of skills. For example, the Cambodian lawyers and judges who were involved in this proceeding in almost every instance had never written a legal opinion before. Almost none had deposed a witness in a formal setting. Very few, if any, had used computerized record keeping. Very few, if any, had used legal precedents in making decisions as opposed to simply evaluating the merits of the immediate case before them. All of those experiences are being internalized to some degree through this process, and we have evidence that some of them are being brought back to the judicial academies, to the law schools, and to the courtrooms. This process is far from perfect, and we could go on with some of the defects of it, but there have been some noteworthy positive effects.
That's the best case. So,
a working group was established in 1998, I think, and by the Secretary General of the UN at the request of the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Human Rights in Cambodia, to go to Cambodia to ascertain whether or not it would be, the conditions existed for trials of the Khmer Rouge to take place in a reasonable manner in Cambodia. And the working group did conclude that no, it would not be possible. But nonetheless, the discussions continued, and a complicated compromise arrangement was in the end agreed upon. You know much more about that than I do, but one of my questions, because of course we were trying to build the capacity of the judiciary in Cambodia at the present time, and of course it was extremely difficult. But I wonder, and this is speculative, whether had instead the international community decided, actually, we can't have these trials until we can see some real progress in the judicial system today, because unless we can, there's no way that having trials for the past are going to be able to bring any credible results. That I wasn't meaning to, but the other issue I just wanted to respond to John on is I agree that Cambodians suffer from a lot of anxiety, and with good reason. Their history has been appalling, and that has been a history of 2 and more decades of war. The Khmer Rouge period was the darkest period, but the other years of war and conflict were also terrible. So when one's talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, I think it applies to the whole of that period. I think we'd all be suffering from stress if we'd had to live through 25 years of continuing war and conflict. But then my other question is really, people, at least in my experience of Cambodia, people are longing for decent lives. Their lives are really hard. And in a way, I suppose I feel that instead of the trials, if more effort had been made to try to get Cambodia onto a better economic and political path, that might have actually served the Cambodian people better. But from my perspective, the amount of effort, diplomatic effort, and the effort of others in getting the trials off the ground and then keeping the trials on track has been huge. And there's a certain amount of energy that the diplomatic community has. So putting that huge amount of energy into the trials has meant diverting energy away from the present. And if only, I often thought, if only the diplomats would give attention to the recommendations that our Special Representative for Human Rights in Cambodia was making in reports to the General Assembly and the Commission on Human Rights twice a year, if only they had given attention to those recommendations. But very, very few did, because the government didn't like the recommendations. Many of them didn't want to support a strong human rights presence in Cambodia for many reasons. And so that in and of itself, they're ignoring these recommendations, almost added to impunity, while at the same time they were arguing, oh no, but we're dealing with impunity, we're supporting the trials of the Khmer Rouge, and that will inevitably have a spillover effect for today. I mean, when Kofi Annan, the Secretary General, withdrew from the trials in frustration in 2002, he, by the way, had been using what we call in the UN his good offices. He withdrew in frustration because the discussions were, in his view and the view of his legal counsel, going nowhere. He was then pushed back to the negotiating table by the UN's member states, primarily, I think John knows this much better than me,
France and
Japan, Australia, before France and Japan became involved. And he was sent back to the negotiating table, but boxed in by a resolution that had been adopted, not unanimously, but with some abstentions. He had a very poor hand, and in his reports, after he had negotiated to the member states of the UN, he made clear his unhappiness with this arrangement and with many aspects of it. But his unhappiness was ignored, and the trials sort of went ahead. And two of the issues that I think are important to bear in mind, I agree, John, that it's been good that the extraordinary chambers have been in Cambodia, but actually the decision to hold them 10 miles outside the centre, next to the new military command headquarters, is not the greatest incentive for ordinary, everyday Cambodians to go. Transport in Phnom Penh is actually very difficult. To get out to the extraordinary chambers when there's a lot of traffic can take about 2 hours. So it's not that they're next door. And being next to the military high command was also a disincentive for some people who aren't very fond of the military and a bit nervous about it, with good reason. The idea of the UN Secretariat, by the way, had been to have a building in central Phnom Penh that could be converted to court chambers, and would then be a legacy that could be left for the Ministry of Justice or whatever. That sadly didn't happen, and I presume that the extraordinary chambers, once the trials are going to finish, will actually benefit the military high command rather than Cambodia's judiciary. And then there was the question of funding, because the Secretary-General Kofi Annan said, please, these trials must be funded through the regular budget of the UN, through assessed contributions, because if they're not, they will be subjected to all sorts of political interference from both the donors and from the government. And I think he has been proved correct, because the funding issue has been a problem throughout, and you know, again, about that much better than I do. And then I wonder if most Cambodians really do care about the trials when they're dealing with the hardships of today. And when the majority were born after 1979, as I said at the beginning, half the population was 24 years and under. And when educated Cambodians know that the government is manipulating and controlling the trials from behind, and therefore have very little confidence in the process and outcome.
Well, if I may, I'll take up a few of those points. One is that I want to delve in a little more detail into something you brought up that some of the folks in the audience might not know the background on, and that is this 2002 UN withdrawal and having their hand forced by the General Assembly. Just so folks know what we're discussing with that, the UN Secretariat has a legal affairs office, and the legal affairs office within the Secretariat was tasked with negotiating the terms of a tribunal with the Cambodian government. Originally, the UN, mostly with the United States at its back as an impetus, pushed for and advocated an international tribunal on the Yugoslavia or Rwanda model. But the Cambodian government, which had its own historical reasons for distrusting the UN, had physical custody of the defendants and said, no thanks, we'll take your assistance and your money, but we're going to run the show. And there was a struggle for control. in this mixed hybrid court model, which was first introduced by then Senator John Kerry, the Cambodian government said, yeah, we can do mixed tribunal as long as we're the one with the greater number of judges and with most of the control over the key administrative positions, and the UN said the reverse. Eventually, the Cambodians unilaterally in 2001 passed a domestic law creating a tribunal along the lines that they preferred. The UN team from again, this is the legal counsel's office within the Secretariat, goes, negotiates, and says, this isn't acceptable to us, it doesn't meet international standards of justice. When the Cambodian government refused to budge, the Secretariat team walks out. Kofi Annan defended them, right? And then you mentioned that in late 2002, there was a UN General Assembly resolution that more or less told them to take a U-turn, go back to Phnom Penh and cut a deal. I totally agree with you. That meant that Hans Corell, the UN negotiator, had no leverage at all and was stuck with a clunky, problematic institutional creature. Why then did the UN member states involved, like France and Germany, and Japan, do that? And I think it's useful and implicit in your remarks to think about what types of justice and human rights advocacy are both in the interest of the government and in the interest of some of the major powers. And you asked the very important question: what if the international community had refocused some of its energy on dealing with contemporary problems like land takings and environmental degradation and labor rights denial and suppression of the free press in Khmer, rather than focusing this diplomatic capital on the Cambodian tribunal. And I think in theory, if that were possible, almost all Cambodians one would interview, except those who had a direct memory of nuclear family loss in the Khmer Rouge period, would say, yes, we would rather have those resources on getting a better life today. I think part of the struggle with this, and part of my sense of what's been difficult in general about doing human rights work in Cambodia, is that, as I emphasized at the outset, there are a lot of dirty hands in the country. Most of the major powers aren't terribly interested in a broad sort of 1960s to the present accountability process, but are happy to focus on the Khmer Rouge period. And I think that the really tough question, where you and I have slightly different perspectives on, is, well, okay, if in fact there's relative agreement to be able to deal with some of these atrocities of the Pol Pot period, to what extent is it worth channeling resources and political capital into dealing with that problem, and do we lose something? I'm doubtful that too much of the energy or money given to the Khmer Rouge Tribunal could have been reprogrammed given the political interests of some of the donor states. But here's an issue where you would have much more insight than I would, because you were working more directly on those contemporary issues. And certainly to the extent that my hypothesis is wrong, and that some of those resources could realistically have been rechanneled, I think one would find a lot of support in doing that.
So we'd like to have your views on that, and then soon we'll need to open this up to the audience for questions. But the question that sort of comes out of John's comments, and that I've been thinking about during yours, is who do you think actually, in the end, will have benefited most from these Khmer Rouge tribunals? Will it be Hun Sen himself, the Cambodian people? And what do you think, when the dust of history, settles on this, will we look at this and say, well, it was a moment to really redress the crimes of the past, or was it an opportunity wasted, or how do you see it shaking out? And then we'll plan to open things up for audience questions.
I mean, Hun Sen has a certain historical narrative, which is a very simple one, that he and the ruling party rescued the Cambodian people from the Khmer Rouge. And the Khmer Rouge trials, in a way, serve his historic narrative, because again and again and again they bring up the Khmer Rouge past. And in a sense, they risk, one could argue, re-victimizing the Cambodian people in the name of justice, because there's this dark period that keeps being thrown back at them, the Khmer Rouge period. And for the government, of course, it's very useful, because they blame everything onto the Khmer Rouge period. And the Khmer Rouge is a useful scapegoat and a very useful yardstick. I mean, how often have I heard government officials say, but it's much better now than during the Khmer Rouge period. But how could it not be? And so, who's benefited most? I mean, just on that point again, a Cambodian colleague, when I was in Cambodia, said to me, Margo, the Khmer Rouge have done terrible things. They've committed terrible crimes, but they can't be made responsible for everything. And I think that that sort of resonated very deeply with me. So I think in the end the trials will have served Hun Sen, quite frankly. They will have given him legitimacy. Well, it depends on their outcome, of course. And so in that sense, it's a hard question. But if we look at it from the perspective of today, where one person has been convicted, two of the senior leaders have died, two are in their early 80s. There's been a lot of foot dragging. There probably won't be any more who are brought before the chambers. So that's and the person they have convicted had already been in detention since 1999. So the results of the trials, I'm not sure about them. But from my perspective, Hun Sen has benefited from. He's gained legitimacy because he's been seen to be on the side of justice. He really cares. He wants to find a solution for the Khmer Rouge crimes. He has diverted attention from the conduct of his own party and the government that he's led for so many years. I think he's come out rather well, actually.
And I'll play up the differences where I think they might exist between our perspectives on this, although I share many of the same opinions. I think that the legacy of this tribunal is probably most positive in many of its technical aspects and is most negative insofar as in important respects, namely with respect to political interference by Hun Sen and other senior leaders in Cambodia. It has reinforced the sense in which political fiat still outweighs the rule of law. When Margo referenced the fact that there likely won't be other trials, the international co-prosecutor has brought forward a couple of additional cases, one against some regional commanders and one against some former military commanders, and the Cambodian government spokesman and the Prime Minister himself had said no more. We're done after we've had these two trials, and that's clearly very problematic. But let me play up a few things that I think could be positive legacies of this. Every Cambodian law student, political science student, judicial candidate, judge in retraining and so forth is going to be using this trial, this set of trials rather, as the basis for studying the law, in both its positive aspects and with its flaws, in cases where rule of law was upheld and cases in where it was defiled. This is a process that, when surveyed over many years, the general public opinion has remained durably in favor. There's been a little bit of erosion lately because people are tiring of how long the process is taking, but most surveys still show public support for these trials in the 85 to 90% range. When you compare that, and most polls say that public confidence in these tribunals are still in the 70% range in terms of whether or not they're delivering justice for the crimes alleged. Compare that to percentages of people saying they have confidence in domestic courts. Well, that's down in the teens or in the 20s at best. What's the difference? In poll after poll, folks have said, well, the UN is involved in this process, so we think that it's more legitimate. To me, that alone is a pretty powerful piece of evidence that while this is not a good deal for the UN reputationally to be dealing with a very troublesome counterparty and a clunky institution where consent can hold the steering wheel quite tightly. Nevertheless, the UN's presence has had a great ameliorative effect. To the extent that there is a positive legacy out of this tribunal, to the extent that talk about human rights through the tribunal, that the validation of the importance of certain aspects of due process come out of this experience, UN involvement has been crucial. Two little footnotes. One is that up until a few years ago, there was only a single line in Cambodian textbooks about the entirety of the Khmer Rouge period. Students simply didn't learn about it in schools. Most young people went home and they would see an older relative sobbing on the floor from time to time, or they would see a male relative, beating his spouse and so forth, and a lot of different things. I agree with you, it's not all the Khmer Rouge period. There are lots of sources of trauma. But understanding that past is extremely important. This process is not responsible for the new textbooks, but it helps create resources and attention and energy and political space for those types of civil society-led initiatives. And the last thing I would mention is that, which you mentioned at the outset, is that there are demonstrations in Phnom Penh now, and they're the most robust demonstrations in a generation in the country. The incumbent party is weakening. I don't think these trials are responsible for that weakening, but I think that they can be used to contribute to a better understanding of what a rule of law would look like, so that if in fact Hun Sen's regime comes undone, there's at least a very rough and ready model of justice that could be used as a starting point.
So I've noticed a lot of cards coming down here to our question askers here. So why don't we turn to the audience questions then?
Hi, my name is Ceci Burns. I am a first year here at Court School. And our first question actually comes from Twitter. And they want to know, can you imagine the hybrid court or some permutation of it being replicated elsewhere to improve local buy-in for results of court systems, maybe in Sudan or Serbia?
Shall I take that one?
Yes, absolutely.
The United Nations Secretariat describes the Cambodia model as, so remember, Cambodia has a predominantly domestic hybrid court constituted under a domestic law and as an extraordinary part of the domestic system. There are other hybrid courts, like the hybrid court for special court for Sierra Leone and the special tribunal for Lebanon, that are preponderantly international, okay? The Cambodia model specifically, domestic majority, is described as toxic by everybody in the UN Office of Legal Affairs. They didn't want to go into this in the beginning, as Margo described very eloquently, and they don't want to touch it again. But many developing countries are looking at this and saying, for reasons very similar to what Margo outlined with respect to Hun Sen, hey, this is a pretty good deal. We get lots of UN money, we pitch in a little of our own. We get a stamp of legitimacy for the proceedings. We also get some technical training. As long as we control the scope of the prosecution and the personal and temporal jurisdiction in ways that don't touch us or our friends, then this looks like a pretty desirable arrangement. We can expect to see more of what we've seen already in West Africa, where there's a new extraordinary African chambers to try crimes with a majority of Senegalese domestic judges and others from around the region. So we can expect to see most Western states and the UN oppose it. We can expect developing countries to advocate for it. I do expect we're going to see more of these kinds of negotiations over hybrid courts because the ICC is unpalatable. The International Criminal Court is unpalatable to many of the courts that would be subjected to its investigations and its prosecutions.
Though I would interject here that one of the things that made Cambodia be amenable to, or the situation in Cambodia amenable to a hybrid court or any kind of an ad hoc court, was that the crimes took place before 2003 when the
True.
ICC had jurisdiction.
True.
And I think there's actually going to be a different kind of a resistance to having ad hoc, or resistance from a different quarter to having ad hoc tribunals.
It will be hard to get funding
in the future.
for sure.
Yeah, but that's that question. I think it goes kind of right to the heart of things. The UN hated the system, right? Did you want to add anything to that, or do you have other?
I agree.
Maybe add another question.
This question is actually along those lines as well. My name is Brock Redpath. I'm also a first-year MPP student here at the Ford School. And And as you said, President Ciorciari, as long as the government can control the scope, and in this case, the ECCC has a pretty small mandate there. It's a little more amenable to the situation. But Professor Pickens, as you argue the current trial system enables further human rights challenges, are there other means of addressing the Khmer Rouge without this focus on the past affecting the future? And with those small mandates, do you believe that the international community would be involved?
When Kofi Annan withdrew in 2002, I had recently arrived in Cambodia. I had been there for 6 months or so, and it left me in deep shock. I thought, what can happen now? We can't leave this period undealt with. But after a few months, a few weeks before Australia came in and started the move towards a resolution at the General Assembly, I began to think, well, actually, maybe this opens up space. Maybe it's possible to do something else. And there was talk, of course, in Cambodia about truth commissions, but having had experience of truth commissions elsewhere, I realized that that wouldn't be possible. But then I thought, well, maybe a non-governmental effort, maybe having a university or several universities come together in an effort to conduct the research, to publish findings, to bring together people who were respected in the world, in Cambodia, who could have actually at least brought together the facts and held discussions about them, both outside Cambodia and hopefully inside Cambodia. So I think that might have been a way. And then I thought, well, maybe also, what about the funding Faculty of History at the University of Phnom Penh, and training young Cambodian students to be historians, because Cambodia has I don't think Cambodia has many, even now, is apart from DC Kham, but it's not only the Khmer Rouge period that needs to be studied, sure, but in general, Cambodians need to have a better understanding of their history, and they don't have that. Most of the history of Cambodia is written by people from the outside. And then DC Kham is doing a fantastic job in establishing the facts about the Khmer Rouge period. So I think that there were other ways of moving ahead, and maybe that will still happen. One would like to hope that once the trials have finished and it's clear that what they've been able to achieve is incomplete or hasn't met the hopes of many, that other initiatives will be possible, because they will certainly be needed, I think.
So the next question refers back to the UN reputation and the Cambodian buy-in. Are there any other organizations that have this kind of status in Cambodia? And are there other organizations that can do human rights work in an effective way outside of the United Nations through its work?
I'm happy to say a few things, and I'm sure you'll have ideas as well. I think that the UN has a special recognition within the country as in terms of conferring legitimacy on an effort of this kind, but it's not the only one. And indeed, Cambodia has many bilateral aid agencies, including USAID, and we could list a whole host of acronyms of bilateral organizations that do democracy and human rights related programming. I think the substance that's being conveyed in the programs is as important as the entity that is funding them in some cases. And so I don't think that the UN has a lock on legitimacy in this area. And certainly there are a lot of civil society, non-state organizations, including the Open Society Justice Initiatives and Legal Aid Society and others in Cambodia who are doing important human rights work and who have local legitimacy. It has to be a team effort for many of the reasons that Margo was outlining. An official effort, even if there were a broader truth commission, it would inevitably have to be supplemented by a broader array of efforts by civil society, educators, and the like.
I mean, Cambodia has a number of very, very vibrant and very competent non-governmental organizations working for human rights, like Likado, Ad Hoc, many such. And I think that the UN human rights presence, which is a very unique presence, it's a very unusual presence. It doesn't exist in most countries of the world, even if it is somewhat taken for granted in Cambodia. But I think that the UN presence, the human rights presence, has helped to provide a protective umbrella for the non-governmental, local non-governmental organizations in Cambodia, which I have to say have uncomfortable lives. There are times when their leaders are threatened. There's a non-governmental, there's an NGO law which has just been taken out of the drawer yet again, which threatens to restrict their activities and rein them in. So their lives are not easy, and I think that the UN presence has provided a very helpful means of support for them. How long it will be able to will continue is another question, and whether its fate is also tied up with the trials is something that I think we don't know. Some believe that the trials will, when the trials end, that they will be declared a success or a partial success or a partial success. And that linked to that, there will be an argument that now Cambodia has closed, put closure, that's an expression that many use, I don't, on its dark past, that it can now move into the future and has shown that it can try people, that it does have a justice system, and that it does care about these issues, and therefore it doesn't any longer need a special UN presence.
Professor Ciorciari, I believe this is probably more in your realm, but it's spoken as the technicalities and due process being something that can be taken out as a benefit of this. My understanding is that the first sentence in case one was given out was 36 years, only 18 need to be served, that the opinion was criticized as not being very full, I guess. So have you seen any of these benefits stretching out in the local courts?
Well, let me first address the verdict in the first case that you just brought up. Duik, the defendant, the only one who's been convicted, was the overseer of this interrogation and torture facility, and had essentially acknowledged that he was responsible for overseeing these horrific acts. This is the easiest case you could imagine, and it's why the tribunal started with the case against Duik. But there was a big complication, a very important one from a human rights perspective, and just like a lot of the things that Margo and I are discussing with Susan, it's another example of where you can see one human rights norm in tension with another. Before the trial started, Duik was detained for 8 years in the military court in Phnom Penh, and the maximum amount that the maximum duration that somebody can be held under local law is 3 years. So he was extended for a long period beyond what the law would allow him to be held for without facing trial. And therefore, the court had to face this dilemma. We've got this person who's acknowledged committing heinous atrocities, but we also have a very clear-cut violation of a present-day human right of the accused. So exactly an example of the kind of thing that we're discussing. The trial chamber found that the only way to make a sentence reduction meaningful, and therefore to honor the rights of the accused, was to subtract off of a term sentence, meaning a number of years. And that number had to be small enough that the subtracted figure would be meaningful. So it started with 35, subtracted some for his cooperation and some for his pretrial detention, and wound up with a figure that you could imagine might at least theoretically allow him to walk a few days before he passes away, right? that was widely and roundly criticized by survivors who said, his rights, what about the rights of my departed relatives who were given no rights at all when he tormented them and then killed them? And so the appeals chamber, in what was widely perceived to be a sort of reaction to that public pressure, increased his sentence to a life sentence without having been asked to do so by the prosecution. And that was an illustration of how this tension plays out between the very legitimate longing for justice for the past and the very important effort that needs to be made to respect human rights in the future. I thought the trial chamber had it right. As heinous as his crimes were, we can't beat terror by abridging the rights of the defense. And so I and some other human rights lawyers applauded that sentence reduction as being better than them, than the Khmer Rouge. Most victims didn't agree, and it's easy to understand why. On the second part of your question, could you remind me? Sorry.
Have you seen any of these?
Oh, the effects in the local courts. We don't yet know whether the effects are going to be manifest in different sentences of people, but we've seen a number of instances in which technical changes have taken place. Mind you, the Khmer Rouge, Susan started by saying that sometimes they killed people just for having glasses. It was an anti-intellectual movement because it saw intellectuals as being tied to the bourgeoisie and to the foreign imperialists. And so lawyers were among those who were killed en masse or who fled the country if they were lucky. Very few trained lawyers. Most of the people on this court have the equivalent of a high school degree, but they're the most senior people in the bar in Cambodia. And so although you're looking at a pretty small number of a couple hundred judicial staff and lawyers, that's a significant share of the overall judicial system in Cambodia. And some of them have begun to bring back lessons. A couple of them have computerized their dockets and their case files in the local courts. A few of them have begun giving training on things like cross-examination, use of documents as evidence, forensics. Those are things that really didn't exist in advance of these trials. So it's a modest, it's a modest plus, but it's a plus to be sure.
So it was mentioned that half the population is under 24, and with the Khmer Rouge period 35 years ago, what does that affect on this process and the necessity of this process and the usefulness of the healing on such a young population?
Well, that's also my question.
Meaning you don't think that there is too much of a...
Not immediately. I mean, of course, you can then, I mean, there's been many studies of how trauma is passed from one generation to another. I mean, I think that Cambodia today has so much to traumatize people just in everyday living. I mean, the facts that I shared with you at the beginning show that life is not easy for people, for most people. It's very, very hard. And of course, for young people, it's hard because there's a great deal of unemployment. Education, I think, certainly at secondary school level leaves something to be desired. So I don't think that young people have a huge amount to look forward to, but they also have huge expectations. And I think what is extraordinary about Cambodia, when you think about it, was that this was a country that was almost entirely isolated from the larger world until the UN arrived in 1992. And then most of the population was not, I mean, of course, when the UN was there for this 18 months that John referred to, it was everywhere. But this is a country which has suddenly been pulled into the modern world. And I think that for young people, it's very disorienting. And certainly, I mean, I found several parents were distressed because their children had got involved in drugs and other such. I mean, and there's not a lot of things for young people to do in Phnom Penh either, in terms of sort of sports clubs or any possibilities, places for young people to gather. So
Could I add something to that? And that is that most young people don't have a sense of wanting retributive justice, since they weren't alive during the period at issue. Most don't know very much about this period. Many don't believe it happened. They hear it and they say, "This is a fantastical tale spun up by my uncle, on his chair." How could our population really have self-immolated in that way during the Khmer Rouge period? They simply don't believe it. And so what they need most out of this process is something that it's hard for criminal trials to deliver, which is a sense of the history. Criminal trials are not designed to provide a sense of history. They're designed to focus on the facts that are germane to the guilt or innocence of the accused. Margo mentioned earlier that the idea of a truth commission was mooted in the late 1990s and was dismissed almost out of hand. And there are a few reasons for it. I mean, one is that there are a lot of people with a disinterest in having a full vetting of history in Cambodia, as we both alluded to. But the second issue, and this is one that I think is another point that's useful for the students especially who are interested in human rights, as of the late 90s, trials were still seen as the gold standard of transitional justice. Truth commissions were seen as something kind of watered down if you couldn't do a trial. But they're not mutually exclusive. In fact, in many ways, they should be mutually reinforcing, because criminal trials can only properly be understood when they're a part of a response to societal scale crimes, if they're embedded within an understanding of how these individual acts functioned in the entirety of the abuses. So other countries have had both, and in an ideal world, Cambodia would have had both. Because there weren't official actors that were interested in doing that, as Margo said, it's been up to groups in civil society like the Documentation Center to do their best to have a sort of a surrogate educational program in replacement.
So maybe we have time for one quick question and one quick answer.
Okay, I don't know if this is critical. Try to make it a little more interesting. But much of the discussion of the merits and drawbacks of this tribunal has been based on the cost-benefit analysis of it. Is there an argument for the trials on their intrinsic merit? And also then, do you believe that this, both of you spoke of the importance of having a trend setting of accountability going forward? Do you think it's reached that goal as well? The trend setting of accountability.
Accountability. Will the trial set the standard for accountability?
John, over to you.
Do you want me to start? Okay. I'll answer first and let Margo
60 seconds each.
60 seconds. Will it set a standard of accountability in Cambodia? Not much evidence of that so far. The political elites are still in a position to be able to elude justice for local crimes. The question is whether or not it sets expectations of justice differently than in the past. I think there one might be able to respond that it does have some effect in the near term on how Cambodians perceive things. And is there an intrinsic or sort of a deontological reason to do this, whether or not it's cost-benefit justified? Well, if there's ever a tribunal or ever a set of crimes that would justify a tribunal on that basis, it's these types of offenses, like the offenses of the Pol Pot regime. That's why I tend to be relatively forgiving of the UN for taking a lot of risk in engaging in this adventure, in this unique hybrid court.
Well, from my perspective, of course, it doesn't set a standard for accountability because it's let Hun Sen and the government off the hook for as far as present crimes are concerned. And I mean, I suppose some people could argue that the fact that the trials are so time constricted for this 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days, which was the period of democratic Kampuchea, that those who were who were the outside actors, who were also contributed to Cambodia's distress and destruction in the period before and after the Khmer Rouge democratic Kampuchea, are also sort of let off the hook, if you like, because actually the general public only, when it thinks about Cambodia, the outside public thinks Khmer Rouge. That's it. And inside Cambodia, I think probably that's also increasingly the case. I mean, the Cambodians have a very odd notion of their history. You talk to them and they say, you ask them, when did this happen? And they'll say, oh, that was before the Pol Pot time, or after the Pol Pot time, or during, after UNTAC, etc. I mean, so I don't think it sets a standard for accountability.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for coming. We've learned a lot to think about.